right, Clay, let's go live. And welcome everyone to the May 27, 2021 study session for the Palm Desert City Council. And staff, please take it away.
All right, thank you for joining us, Mayor and City Council members. My name is Eric Seha. I'm the Interim Director for Development Services. We have a number of staff people with us today, representatives from our Planning Division, Public Works, as well as Economic Development. And what we hope to discuss with you today are topics related to the El Paseo Street Corridor, kind of give you a rundown of where we've been, and some of the other items for discussion, including dining decks and design guidelines, some of the business assistance that went into that program, as well as topics for mid-block crossings and the painted crosswalks that are out there. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Kevin Schwartz.
Sorry about that. Thank you. All right, good afternoon. So as Eric mentioned, we'll give a background. We'll start with the dining decks. We'll start with the background, results from what we heard from restaurants, outcomes, potential updated guidelines, and then business assistance. So just a brief background, March 20th, indoor dining was shut down. May 2020, city staff drafted implement guidelines. Some of those were public parking, ADA compliance, safety requirements, aesthetics, design, and then the city council waived the $87 TEP fee. And in June 2020, ABC defined temporary standards to allow alcohol to be served within the dining decks, and the city council enacted an outdoor dining deck program. Currently, this is El Paseo and the frontage road. We have 8 along El Paseo and then 3 within the frontage road within the public right-of-way. These are photos of what they look like. The one on the left is Mom and Gina's. You can see here they implemented K-rail, which was built for safety, and they disguised it with some wood siding. The one on the right is El Corso. This was used as a temporary sidewalk. If you recall that they actually used the existing sidewalk to expand their outdoor patio, and then they used this to alter the sidewalk. But you can see the K-rail water barriers down there. This is Armando's. This is just a wooden platform. Same with the one in front of Daily Grill. And then this is Mimo's. Again, it's just a wood platform. And then the one on the right is Little Bar. So based on the dining deck, the city received a lot of popularity, a lot of gratitude, and thank you for the city council for allowing these to go up. We did conduct a business survey out of the 33 dining decks. We got 24 responses. You can kind of see those on the right-hand side. 92% basically said that they would likely entertain a permanent dining deck. You can see that 96 basically stated that it did not impact parking. They saw an increase in revenue, and 88% saw that the diners had a very good experience. The last one is kind of a wide range, but based on the responses, they were willing to spend anywhere between $1,000 to $150,000 to install a permanent dining deck. As I mentioned before, we did issue 33 temporary use permits, 22 on private property, and then 11 within the public right-of-way. Lastly, ABC rules. ABC, again, allowed temporarily alcohol to be served in these. Going forward, city staff is going to be keeping a close eye on that. That goes with the permanent dining decks. If ABC does not allow alcohol to be served in them, would restaurants still want to have one permanently? So with that, I want to turn it over to Mr. Randy Bowman.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon. So the outcomes, in other words,
can I have one moment? When would you like us to ask questions?
Anytime you would like. We'll be happy to take questions as we present.
Okay, then I have a question for Kevin, if I may. You said 92% said they would, what was it, that they were likely or very likely or to spend additional money or to participate creating permanent. What the 8%, what did they say?
Well, it was probably it was a like or very likely, and there's probably like a moderate one. So it's probably in the middle.
Okay, thank you. That was it.
I have
All
a
right,
question
so-
if we can, if
Oh,
we're
yeah.
on in the question break. I saw the stars where you point to where the dining decks are on along El Paseo. Are there other parts of the city where dining decks have been enacted as well?
There
Because
are.
I
So
know
there's-
that there was a question about how this impacts other parts of the city. So just wanting to check for parity.
There are. There's 33 out there, but we're just focusing on the ones that are in the right of way. The other ones are within private parking lots.
So none of the other ones. So just to confirm, the only ones we're just on the map is because they're in the public right of way, not because we're focusing on this part of the city, but just because it's a different type of permit.
Well, as you'll see, we're focusing on all the dining decks moving forward, but these ones are for safety measures and the other ones as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. You're running the slides, so I'll cue you up for the next slides. Outcomes equals next steps that staff is recommending. We're recommending to extend the program. Kevin will wrap up after I talk about the guidelines, wrap up with the recommendations from staff. I will go through the updated design requirements, and Martine will talk about the grant assistance. So the elements of the guidelines, I think it's a lot based on our experience with the dining decks in Palm Desert, as well as looking at what other communities have experienced with dining decks during this COVID period. We are pursuing a common sense approach. We didn't put everything in writing because of the hurried nature of the initial guidelines. So we want to add some common sense language to the guidelines, and I'll give you some examples as we present. Certainly, we want to increase the safety. One reason, Councilmember Quintanilla, that we highlighted the location of the decks that are in the public right-of-way. They are in public roadways, and so safety obviously is number one for no matter where you are, but particularly for the city's interest, the safety of the decks that are in the public roadways adjacent to travel lanes. So that was really the purpose of that slide.
Hey, Randy, some of the outdoor dining decks are in private parking lots. Does the city not have a concern, legal or otherwise, about the safety of those decks?
Of course we do. Of course we do. But in the case of the public right of way, it's from the aspect that the city owns the right of way. But the safety components that we're talking about, council member, really apply no matter where you are.
Okay, so any kind of ordinance or standards that we would develop would apply to any outdoor dining deck, whether on a public right of way or on a private parking lot. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's essentially correct.
Okay, thank you.
We're also going to talk a little bit about aesthetics. Another common sense approach is being a good neighbor, from a dining deck applicant to the neighbors that abut them, and of course the city collaboration in the program. Next slide, please, Kevin. So we're suggesting that with our experience, define a dining deck. It was initially the words dining, which implies people eating. But as we saw with El Corso used their dining deck as an expansion and a reroute of pedestrian traffic around expanded sidewalk dining. So we've incorporated that into our definition, if you will, of dining decks. Next slide, please. So design criteria, some of these were in the initial guidelines. Some of them are lessons learned, experiences with the dining deck. Certainly roadway speed. We're not recommending placing dining decks along 50-mile-an-hour roadways. I don't think that's something we would recommend. So we're recommending really stay on the 25-mile-an-hour roadways. And also sight distance, when a deck is placed near a corner, we want motorists and pedestrians to see each other around a corner. So we need to accommodate the sight distance around a dining deck. Existing parking usage. So we have some red curbs, which are no parking, standing, or stopping. That's usually for fire hydrants. We want to make sure that those fire hydrants are accessible. But we also have some other types of usage like yellow loading zones and green timed parking. So when an applicant might propose a dining deck that overlays with an existing parking restriction, we would need them to be a good neighbor, talk to the holder or the initial requester of those parking restrictions, so that we're not unduly causing a burden on neighbors. It does rain.
And do you want to insert your question, Jan?
Oh, that's okay.
There's a
I'll
hand
wait
raised.
until you're at the end at the good neighbor part. I'll wait till that. Thank
Okay, very good. Thank you. The drainage, of course, it does rain on occasion, and we need to make sure that the water doesn't wash things away, and also isn't blocked by a dining deck. So we need to make that clear in the guidelines. That also plays into staff's recommendation with the input that we had from the economic subcommittee, that let's not have dining directly on the pavement, but rather raise the dining decks up above the surface of the pavement. Utility accessibility, manholes, water valves, gas valves, et cetera, that are in the roadway. We don't want to lay a deck over that lest the utility companies cannot access them. I've already mentioned fire hydrants, and now again, being a good neighbor, if the dining deck that you might request goes beyond your property boundaries, the city would want you to talk with your neighbors to make sure that that is an acceptable use with the neighbors. Councilmember Harnick, did you have a question?
I have a comment, and thank you. What I saw the other day next to the dining decks, and I think we've probably all noticed increased bicyclists. When they parked their bikes, they parked them perpendicular to the curb and right up next to the dining decks. And the dining decks created very naturally a bicycle parking area. So now the bikes aren't on the sidewalk. They're not obstructing any flow on the sidewalk, but they worked. It happened naturally. It made perfect sense to see those bicycles next to the dining deck and then at a 90-degree angle with the curb. So just a little comment there.
Thank you, Councilmember. We do want to mention bicycle parking. I got that in an upcoming slide. Good observation. Next slide, please, Kevin. So safety, as you saw, we have a couple of examples of dining decks that have incorporated either concrete barriers or water-filled barriers into their design. Staff is recommending that all dining decks, existing and upcoming or future decks, incorporate barriers into the design of the decks. The barriers we're recommending be wrapped or covered with materials that are complementary to the deck, and we've discussed recommending reviews by the Architectural Review Commission. With feedback that we got from the Economic Subcommittee, question was, do we need to see a solid line of barriers, or is there opportunity for us to allow gaps in between barriers? The answer is yes. Our contractual city engineer looked at how a lot of other communities have approached this. Many of them have allowed for gaps in between barriers. So the example that you see on the screen, City of Pasadena, shows planters, which in my mind you would call those a barrier, but in between there is something that prevents someone, say, getting up from their seat, walking into the street, or falling backwards out of the dining deck. So we would recommend in the guidelines that there be something, railing or cable, that prevents patrons from leaving the deck purposefully or accidentally in between the gaps between barriers. And also we're recommending to council, and I'm jumping ahead for Kevin's slide, but we are recommending that since the barriers are nominally 2 feet wide at the bottom, and we are asking for the dining deck applicants to incorporate, to retrofit barriers into their existing decks, that expands the width of the deck. And so to accommodate that, staff is recommending that we narrow the lanes on El Paseo, where we have our primary number of parallel parked decks. We reduce the lane widths, and I believe I've got a slide coming up that I'll explain on that. Next slide, please, Kevin.
Randy,
Yes, ma'am.
on that last slide, Do you mean 15, the middle bullet point? Do you mean 15 feet or 15 inches?
15 feet or less.
So gaps between barriers are allowed. Explain 15 feet or less.
Sure. So you see the graphic of the water fill barriers. Those are usually 6 feet long. So you would line them up where you'd have 6 feet of a water fill barrier, and then up to a gap of 15 feet until the next barrier. In that gap, we're recommending
15 feet is big. I mean, 15 feet is enough for a car to get through. So that can't be right. And it's not what's illustrated from the city of Pasadena.
Yes, that's our contractual city engineer is assisting, and I think he's having audio problems unless he can be elevated. But he had just texted me that the gap standard is what he saw with the city of Long Beach, and it is 15 feet.
What do we mean by that? I just don't comprehend.
I'm sorry, I don't have a graphic to illustrate it, but if you look at Mama Gina's in perspective, if you have one K rail, yeah, thanks for the cursor help, Kevin. If you have one K rail that's 6 feet long, then our city engineer is recommending that we could go up to 15 feet until you install the next K rail. And then the gap in between the K rail would be some kind of a railing or cable structure that prevents people from leaving the deck.
Well, I'm just the feedback is that sounds crazy, and it's not what's illustrated from the city of Pasadena. The gaps in that illustration are much smaller than 15 feet and look much more sensible. So Mayor Pro Tem Harnick wants to weigh in.
A quick comment. I would think with all of the decks that have been very quickly designed and put up, that there's got to be some people who really know this business and can help us out with this, and who are experts both aesthetically and for safety purposes would be able to help us go along. I would imagine there is a new field here that we can rely on and we can get information from.
I think the important thing. Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Nistandi.
Oh, Randy, I was just going to say, I'm trying to understand what you're saying to make sure we're understanding it properly. Are you literally talking about a gap of 15 feet? Or I saw Kevin pointing on his cursor to the little strips down below. I forget what you're calling them. And that you would have met, yeah, that. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're talking would be the gap, but you'd still have that 4-foot structure?
Yeah, the barriers are nominally 6 feet long. Like what we're hearing from the contractual city engineer is that he's recommending no more than 15 feet. If the city is comfortable with a gap of less than 15 feet, that's certainly something that the city can require.
Randy, I don't know if you see him, but Stephen Latino is on the Zoom meeting now.
Yes, I did get added. So I had to, I apologize. I'm the only one in here without a tie, I think, at this point. So aside from Andy. And this is a very new concept in terms of it becoming permanent. So many of the standards that are out there for parklet designs and dining decks is really temporary in nature. I've made a lot of calls to colleagues throughout, Southern California and had a lot of conversations about this as part of this process. And so a lot of agencies have even taken the approach that this will go away. So it's really hard to find good standards because people haven't developed a long-term standard. The 15 feet was pulled from the city of Long Beach. The city of Long Beach probably has the best in terms of like approved standards where they actually plan on doing it long-term. And that was just a starting point. I'm in the same boat as Randy here is that was a starting point for the conversation. I think that if we feel comfortable with it being shorter, I would have no problem, taking it to a shorter number. Again, this was a relatively quick put together in the nature of how it came to be. So we had to glean as much information as quickly as we could from agencies who have implemented any standards at this point. And like I said, most of the conversations I had were, we reacted so fast, we didn't really put standards in. A lot of cities didn't even have things in writing. And a lot of them are already talking about removal. So
May I
whatever
ask a follow-up question?
Let's go with Councilmember Quintanilla and then Councilmember Jonathan.
Thank you, Mayor. My question in trying to decide what is the best middle ground, what is the cost of each of these barriers? We're again trying to figure out how this factors in of the business owners that we're going to ask of them. I can see if we're trying to say 15 is too much, how much an additional expense are we asking them to incur? But I do think that 15 is far too much, especially if we're looking at them going to be elevated. We're looking at increased ADA issues. We want to be sure that no one has any balance issues as they're already making their ascent. I think that 15 is far too much, but also must be considered within the expense that we're asking.
Sure. Councilmember Quintanilla, you had asked rough cost for the barriers. If you went out to a contractor's supply website, you'll probably see the water fill barriers cost about $400 each, and that's without the water. So that's more or less delivered.
And Councilmember Jonathan.
Thanks, Mayor. Are these also known as Jersey barriers? Is that the same thing?
The concrete K-rail down below is Jersey barrier for sure. The water fill barriers, I prefer to just call those water fill barriers. They're not quite a Jersey barrier.
And those are the ones that are being proposed, is the water filled ones?
Yeah, either or.
Either or, okay.
Yeah. So
Jersey is a reference to cement, interesting. I won't pursue that. So the
and it came from
takeaway is,
Jersey.
I'm not gonna say anything, yeah. So the takeaway is that 15 feet is somewhat arbitrary, but whatever, I mean, we're free to choose whatever gap we want, certainly less than that. My question to you is, covering the barriers, is staff proposing that be mandatory?
Yes, we are.
Very good, thank you.
And sure, and Kevin, is there something addition you want to add about the ARC component?
Yeah, so the idea is that these decks, they would propose it to us and then we would run it by the city's architectural review commission to make sure that there's compatibility, along the street in regards to materials. Okay,
thanks, Kevin.
I'm sorry, I have one more question too. The city of Pasadena, it looks so pretty with the landscaping that they have. Is that actually considered a barrier comparable to like a concrete K-rail?
Steve, I'm going to ask you to chime in on that.
I didn't do as much research directly on the city of Pasadena as much as we were just trying to pull some examples of what they could look like. There are some alternatives that have been implemented in the city of LA as part of their al fresco program, as well as in Santa Monica, where they use large planters. And I'm trying to remember what the number was. There was one of the guidelines said it needs to be able to withstand something like 750 pounds of lateral force or something like that, was how they classified it in order to justify what they could use for material. And I'd have to go back and reread some of those guidelines and find that exact verbiage if that was something that we'd be wishing to do.
Thank you. I'm just one opinion here. It just looks pleasing to my eyes, looking at that. Versus the water-filled barriers.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen one where it is a K barrier surrounded by material like we see for Pasadena, and the planter sits on top of the barrier. I've seen one like that, so that's possibly what we're looking at as well, correct?
That is correct. I don't remember if there was, I think there might have even been one in the city of Palm Desert, Randy, in the pictures you had originally sent over that may have had that. I know I saw it, but I've worked several late nights, so I apologize if I don't know exactly where I saw it at on some of this. So,
yeah. So as we leave this, I would encourage us to look at guidelines that leave space for new products that achieve the same goals as today's water-filled barriers or concrete K-rails.
Thank you, Mayor. Next slide, please, Kevin. So to add a K-rail around an existing dining deck that's in a parallel parking space on El Paseo, you just simply need more room. We have allowed, permitted the dining decks on El Paseo to absorb the full width of the parking, which is 8 feet. The travel lanes on El Paseo are 12 feet each in each direction. So the current graphic up above shows the current layout, 8 feet and 2 12s and 2 12s and 8 feet. We're proposing that to accommodate the extra width for wrapping a deck with a barrier by reducing the travel lanes in each direction by 1 foot each, so that we make up that 2 feet that you would need, so that the existing decks could stay in their current width, plus be wrapped by the barriers. And then to Councilmember Harnick's question earlier, bicycle parking, a suggestion was made, I believe, at the Economic Subcommittee meeting. Should we consider incorporating bicycle parking? I think the answer from staff is yes, we'd recommend bicycle parking be incorporated. I think it's a collaboration between the city and a deck permittee that if they are interested in bicycle parking, the city could then work with them to either provide bicycle parking on the sidewalk or even in the pavement, if that makes sense. And I think with the appropriate aesthetics and safety components, of course.
I'm not sure we want to leave this up to restaurant by restaurant determination. There's a public purpose in affording bicycle parking, particularly given some of the proposals that will be reaching council about enhancing our Palm Desert Connect bicycling routes.
So, Mayor, what I heard you say is that perhaps the city should take a more holistic overview approach to bicycle parking. Don't just leave it up to each applicant, but think about the broader picture.
Yes.
Should be part of the permit to have a deck, is that is provided. And it's so we avoid putting bicycles on the sidewalk. We don't want them on the sidewalk. If they're on the pavement and aligned with the deck, we, I think, solve a few problems with that.
Okay, thank you, council members. Let's go to the next slide. So platform design again.
Hey, Randy, I'm sorry, just before you leave bicycle parking, the
Yes, sir.
Economic Subcommittee addressed decorative bike stands as opposed to standard bike stands.
Yes, sir.
That's
Yes, you
still-
did mention that.
That will still be part of staff recommendation.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
So for platform design, again, raised above the pavement is what we've heard and what staff is recommending. Don't allow, like in the lower left-hand corner, don't allow dining directly on the pavement surface. So raise the deck above the pavement surface, either flush with the curb or placed on top of curb. Of course, ADA compliance needs to be satisfied between the deck and the existing outdoor dining that an applicant may have. We did brief the Economic Subcommittee that there may be flexibility in the city applying the ADA standards to the totality of outdoor dining for any one given user between what they already have on the sidewalk plus the deck. There may be some flexibility that the deck may not have to be fully ADA compliant, but that will vary from applicant to applicant and what they propose. And then, of course, we will consistently apply ADA rules. And then lastly, common sense. We're not recommending any permanent installations, meaning no permanent modifications to the roadway, to the sidewalk, no removals of public assets or bolting of things to the roadway. Next slide, Kevin. Okay, I'm going to be turning this over to Martine to talk about the business assistance.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of the City Council. As we've discussed dining decks, this was an opportunity that the City Council allowed our business owners and restaurants in particular to take advantage to add some square footage while the impacts of COVID came into play. And as we've seen, these decks have become popular, have become very useful, and people have enjoyed them. So we have met with our Economic Development Subcommittee, and we are recommending, which you'll have an item as part of the open session, that we continue to waive the TUP or temporary use permit fee. As these decks get reevaluated, we're going to be recommending a $5,000 grant per restaurant. This would be for any new or existing outdoor dining deck that meets our design guidelines, that meets the safety and aesthetic criteria, and allows us to reimburse them up to the $5,000 for costs associated with those upgrades. And we have some information here on for our public who's watching of how they can reach out to us if this is approved at a later date. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Martine, would this be for outdoor dining throughout the city, any place in the city?
Yes, this would be encompassing the entire city, any restaurateur that would like to participate.
Okay, so I'll just go pretty quick. Staff does have 3 recommendations that will be in front of you during open session. One is to extend the existing temporary use permits for the outdoor dining decks for 1 year with an option to extend it for a 2nd year. The other one is to implement the outdoor dining deck design guidelines so that Mr. Bowman presented with changes as stated today. And then direct staff to work with the restaurant owners to modify the dining decks to comply with those guidelines. And again, this is for every dining deck throughout the city. And then the last one is what Mr. Martin Alvarez touched on, is that authorize staff to utilize and match fund for the $5,000 restaurant. And again, it's throughout the city.
So would the guidelines come back to us after the changes just discussed?
If you would like them to, staff can bring them back, but
I think we discussed quite a few elements, and it would be a good thing for them to come back.
okay.
We will bring them back.
Okay, and then I have another question too. When will it be determined how much it will cost for each restaurant to comply with the standards we set? Do we have any idea offhand, or how will we find out what the cost will be to make the different restaurants meet the standards?
Randy, do you want to take that?
Yes, I think with the final guidelines that we'll be presenting to City Council for approval, I think after that, we're going to have to work with each individual applicant, particularly if council wants to entertain some form of gap in between barriers. Some restaurant owners may want a complete row of barriers. Others may want to include gaps. So I think those costs would vary from applicant to applicant.
I guess, what my question is, some of the restaurants have already spent several thousand on their outdoor dining deck. So me as a council member, like, for example, I'm saying, oh, I like landscaping. Well, if that becomes part of our guideline, but it's going to cost each restaurant owner another $2,000 because I'm saying I like landscaping, I wouldn't necessarily want that. For me, I'd like to know the guidelines that we're saying we want and the cost associated to the restaurants that currently have dining decks.
Councilmember, we can estimate, say if an applicant, if all applicants wanted to completely wrap their decks with barriers, we can estimate that safety upgrade cost. Kevin, I'm going to look to you to help me out on the second part of this. The one thing I don't know is the cost for, say, the aesthetic wrapping of the barriers. It's easy for me as an engineer to estimate the safety components, but maybe not the aesthetic components. So Kevin, do you have some help on that?
Yeah, we don't have numbers on those.
Let me suggest, Gina, that one benefit of the ARC process is that it allows restaurants to achieve a good aesthetic result in a variety of ways. So that might be plans for some of them, but it doesn't have to be plans for all of them. We can use the ARC to look at the specific design that the restaurateur proposes and works for them.
Thank you, Mayor. That's a wonderful insight. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Harnick.
Thank you. And with all the discussion of what the cost will be for the restaurateurs, whether it's they're complying with safety or with aesthetic standards, I think, and again, this is throughout the city. We're not just singling out one little area. This is about making sure that the standards are appropriate throughout our city. I think it would really be in the best interest to get out in front of anything going in front of ARC, and then ARC looking at it and going, this doesn't even come close to what we would expect for whatever area of the city it is. Can we get out in front and get some professional guidance on this and be so kind as to provide our restaurateurs with some guidelines that they would be able to work with and have some directions before they go out? And we all are sympathetic with, and some of us empathetic with what the restaurants have gone through to try and stay afloat during this very difficult time, and to ask them to go out and come up with designs and spend money on that without providing them with some guidelines, I think sounds unfair. We should give them something to work with initially.
Councilmember Jonathan.
Thank you, Mayor. Two quick things. Number one, on what the Mayor Pro Tem just said, I couldn't agree more. I think we want to continue making this an easy process on our restaurateurs. And I love our ARC, but they can be very detail oriented, as well they should be. But these outdoor dining decks at this time is not such an occasion. So I'd like to find a way to make it easy on our restaurateurs. I think maybe if there are pre-approved basic plans that can be, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of, there can be variations on that, but if there's basics like, the K barriers, no more than 3 foot separations, covered, et cetera, that it's going to be approved. And then if there are going to be visual enhancements, then that's not a problem. Maybe it doesn't even have to go through ARC at this point, because this is an extension of a temporary use permit. So, maybe it's staff approval. I don't know, but I think study session is about giving direction. So speaking for myself, I echo the Mayor Pro Tem's concerns that we continue to make it as easy as possible on our restaurant industry. The second point is really a question, and that is, back to design standards for a second. Are we requiring shading vis-a-vis a roof, slats, cloth, anything like that? Or are we allowing outdoor decks to be without any form of shading?
It's not a requirement, but I mean, I think most restaurants are putting in those shade elements
It's only a requirement if they want customers.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't have an opinion, but I'm bringing the question up because staff maybe should think about that. I'm not sure if that should be one of the design requirements. I'm not offering an opinion. I'm just saying we need to think about that. We are in the desert.
Mayor Pro Tem, may I weigh in briefly and then call on you?
And I see Councilmember Quintanilla has also.
Great. What I was going to suggest is two things. Some pictures of approvable approaches might meet the objective that's been discussed. For example, I forget if it was Mama Gina's or one of our current texts that had covered the barriers quite satisfactorily. Some pictures of approvable approaches might remove too much subjectivity. I do think we should stick with ARC approval rather than staff approval because it's a public process, and I think it puts staff in a bit of a bind to be the last word. Who wants to go next?
Mayor, I've got a question. In terms of we're talking about extending the temporary use permit, is there any thought to when this issue might be revisited as we're talking about extending this? Looking into our magic crystal ball that we don't have, there may be a plan down the line where this no longer meets the needs of the city, and the opportunity to have a discussion on when this may be reconsidered may also give the business owners the opportunity to decide how much they want to dedicate as this of an investment.
Mayor, if I could, staff was recommending that the TUPs be extended for 1 year, exactly for the reason that you are stating, Councilmember Quintanilla. We don't know where this is going. We need ABC to weigh in a little bit more clearly to us. And there is legislation right now in Sacramento that would allow these types of setups, but obviously it has to get passed. So you're right. And our intention was to try to provide some direction for the next year and revisit it again. Mayor, one of the things I did want to ask with regard to the ARC, we could certainly work with some of the other cities, put together a design booklet, which I think I'm hearing the council would like to see. Would you like the ARC to weigh in on that on the front end or before it's brought to you, or are we looking at I think that would probably be the most efficient use of everyone's time if they're going to play some role. And then I think the question is, if we can get that standards booklet adopted after they weigh in, then it's probably less of an issue having staff make those calls in the spirit of speed. But I would personally feel more comfortable if they weighed in ahead of time and gave you their recommendation on that. So I just wanted to throw that out there for the council's consideration.
Yeah, that sounds like a great solution. And so whatever staff is comfortable with, I think you've heard feedback from several of us that we want to achieve that positive aesthetic end result without driving restaurateurs crazy.
Yeah. We're probably going to need a couple meetings. We'll be back to the second meeting in June with the booklet that gives us time to get the ARC, put together some issues. We know that we need to get these standards ready for you and for the restaurant community before we go on break. So does that sound like a doable plan?
Does to me.
Okay.
Mayor Pro Tem has been waving or a little virtual hand there. So jump in.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, I have the random question here. Are these decks only for dining? Would there ever be a time we'd say, you know, that deck would be great there with a little living room furniture for people to sit and talk? And are we restricting this to dining? And I know when we go to the shopping center convention, we always see the importance of putting furniture around for people to sit and relax and, you know, create that sense of community. So are we going to restrict it only to dining? Is it something that even the city might want to say, we're putting a deck on this end of the street so that people can stop and relax for a moment?
It was staff's recommendation to separate the parklet concept that you're describing from the dining decks. If down the road, council wants to head the parklet direction, we can do that. Those tend to be more permanent, different way of constructing those. They also tend to draw folks that will sit there all day, and there's a pros and cons to that you need to think about.
Okay, thank you.
Does that complete our intended business?
It does for dining decks. We were going to talk about the raised crosswalks and the painted crosswalks if you'd like.
Give it a try.
Okay, I'll go through it fast.
You may want to just go right to your recommendations, Kevin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so policy direction is we're recommending 2 additional raised mid-block crossings on the west end. The exact locations have not been determined, but we're thinking the first one should be between the block of Ocotillo Drive and Sage Lane. That's the first main block from 74. And then the second crosswalk should be between Lupine and San Pablo. This is a map. I'm not saying there should be 3 crosswalks within Ocotillo and Sage. This is just an option of where one could go. Priority 1 would be directly in the middle. There's a median break. It would eliminate the U-turn. That's shown here. So essentially just go right in this area. So it would eliminate this U-turn, but that would be priority 1. This is just kind of a ground floor looking at it. And this would be eliminating what this car is trying to achieve. So that would be priority 1 in that block. The second block is Lupine and San Pablo. This is a smaller block, but this area does get a lot of foot traffic, especially during lunchtime from employees from the gardens traveling over to the mini fast casual restaurants over here. There is a vehicle access right here into the El Paseo Square. The owners here want to vacate this and make this a pedestrian access. So lining this crosswalk up with that would make sense. This is basically a ground floor looking at this. So it would reduce this. The crosswalk would be right about here, and it would allow maybe Coffee Bean to expand their patio. So those are the 2 locations. We're not asking for construction. We're just directing staff to initiate a request for proposal for engineering design services. The cost would not exceed about $50,000. That was a similar cost for the 3 existing ones. Part of evaluating these locations is you have to look at such things as manholes, stormwater, storm gutter locations, loss of parking. And then you do have to conduct a lot of outreach with businesses and property owners. So again, we're not asking to construct this, but we would bring back those final designs and those exact locations for council's approval and the cost. On the painted crosswalks,
Looks like you've got a couple of questions on crosswalks.
Mine is real quick. Can you show us a map of El Paseo from San Pablo to 74 so we can get an idea where those raised crosswalks are going to go?
So it's a smaller one, but can you see up top here?
Uh-huh.
So this is 74 here.
Right.
All the way to Portola. Let me move the faces here, but this would be the first block here.
Okay.
Right in this area, and then the San Pablo block would be right here.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Are there any more questions on the raised crosswalks? No. Okay, so painted crosswalks. Again, I won't get into too much, but we're recommending to leave the painted crosswalks at this time. We've determined to remove them and be about $160,000 to $280,000 to remove them. So we believe keeping them at this time, and then to investigate other costs for decorative treatments such as pavers, bricks, or colored concrete. Currently, I put this up there. This is what Chartwell Properties did. The California Pizza Kitchen's right here, but they currently have existing pavers on the 4 corners around Daily Grill. So something like that could work. And then if that's the direction you would like to go, then we can report back to City Council with design concepts and cost. So that concludes that. If you want this was from the staff report. I could leave that up. Otherwise, are there any questions?
Looks savvy.
Thank you. So I mean, this is a study session, so we're just commenting and giving direction and whatnot. So let me express a concern, and I brought it up before. As we go through and have our businesses invest in enhanced dining decks, and as we go through and spend $50,000 just to study mid-block crosswalks, much less build them, it occurs to me that we started a process of completely reimagining El Paseo, and we'll hopefully resume that process soon. So I have concerns about doing this kind of out of order, kind of, you know, the cart before the horse. I'm not sure that any of what's being recommended to El Paseo, other than perhaps extending the dining deck permits, is necessary at this time. I would ask staff whether they're prepared to comment now or address that concern later. Why is it necessary to do it now, as opposed to let's just continue with the Gibbs study, pick up where we left off, and you know, we're finishing up with San Pablo, CV Link. Seems like the next logical step is to apply that same kind of energy and creativity to El Paseo. So whether you can answer the question now or later, my concern is, why would we do this now when we anticipate more and more significant changes later, hopefully soon?
The quick answer to your question is that the raised mid-block crossings and the painted sidewalks have been questions provided to us from other council members. So we're reporting back to you. I also believe staff's of the opinion that there is no clear direction on the Gibbs study at this point from council. So if council wants to head that direction and open that up and just say, you know, we'd only like to direct or discuss the dining decks at this point, that's completely your prerogative. So that's why you're seeing those other two subjects. And it really gets down to whether council wants to move forward on the Gibbs study or not.
Let me ask for clarification. Are you saying you don't perceive a consensus about proceeding with which option was recommended by the Gibbs study, or
that is
about proceeding with the complete reimagination of El Paseo?
I think that what has been communicated to me is that there's not been clear consensus on any option in particular with the Gibbs study. There's a couple strong opinions one way and a couple strong opinions the other way. And if I'm off base on that, please feel free to correct me.
Okay, I wouldn't dispute that there's no consensus on which option, but I do think, and I don't know if we need to put this on discussion at a council meeting, but I do think we need to move forward with the redesign of El Paseo. It was my understanding that there was unanimity on that, and we just made a decision to prioritize as far as the downtown city core and implementing the vision of the city, that we decided San Pablo, CV Link were the priorities, but that El Paseo would be next. If there's any question about that, we need to put it on the table and make sure we all understand where we're going.
So there is question about that. There is question among us about whether now is the right time to be considering some major revision to the asphalt on El Paseo. We've learned a whole bunch in the last 18 months. So my own personal perception is that we should continue to learn for at least a couple more years, particularly since it would be the wrong time to launch any sort of major project that could be disruptive to business on the street. So we obviously don't have time, nor is this the occasion for everyone to fully express themselves. I just said that much to feature for you that there is not unanimity of opinion.
Yeah, and that's one person's opinion, and I appreciate it. I've not given my opinion. I've only expressed a concern. So clearly, we need to address this because there's a lack of understanding and clarity as to how we're proceeding. And that's a big ticket item. And it would represent a change from what had been decided before. So not at this meeting, but I don't know the process, whether you need a request for action or whether staff has direction. I think we council members need to talk about it and set our policy and direction, whatever that might be. And do that soon.
And then also, is staff asking for direction on whether to undo the painted crosswalks at a tune of up to 200,000? Because I'm not in favor of that.
So a couple of things. Staff is recommending that we not incur that cost right now. I think the business owners were behind us that was not a prudent expenditure of dollars right now. You know, and in terms of the other issue, I'll punt that to council. If you want a workshop on what to do with El Paseo, that's fine. Then we probably would recommend putting the raised crosswalks on hold. We do need to get moving on the dining deck guidelines, and I think we've got enough direction to put something together and get it back to you in June. So that discussion on the larger discussion on El Paseo, I don't think affects the dining decks one way or another for the next year or two. We need to give those restaurateurs clear direction on where the council's at. So if you want to discuss this in your open session about having another discussion on El Paseo, please feel free to do so, and we'll put the raised crosswalks on hold until we understand where you're at.
Okay, enough for now. Good. It's great to have clarity about our lack of clarity. Council, let's convene in closed session in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.